Good morning. Good to see everyone. Looks like everybody survived the Wrights party. Yeah. Sure, a good time was had by all. So good. All right. Okay. All right. Hello. And good to see everyone. Well, I tell you what, let's start off with a word of prayer. And Greg, can you?
Dear Lord, we're thankful for this day, thankful for the bit of rain that we had in the night. Thankful that you gathered us morning to study from your word and worship you later. We thank you for David leading our class and discussion. We pray that you be with him and all the teachers this morning. We just pray that you'll bless this time of study together the rest of our day.
Well, I saw Justin as I came in, and he said, you realize this is the last day of the quarter. And I said, what about June 30th, next week? He goes, oh, yeah, okay, you're right. So, we were going to have to cover 5 chapters in one day. We could have done it, but we've got this week and one more week to complete our study in this class on the book of John. Last week, we talked about chapters 13 through 16, and again, this is, Thursday night. This is the Passover feast. Jesus is with his apostles for the last night. They've been together for about 3 years, and Jesus, basically in 13 through 16, has his discourse with his apostles. We get to, part of that was, hey, they're going to know you're my disciples by the love you have one for another. I'm going to send the helper when I'm gone, the Holy Spirit. So we understand that. And now in chapter 17, they've been in the upper room in Jerusalem. They've left the upper room. They're on their way toward Gethsemane. Some of the commentators say, well, maybe they stopped at the temple and Jesus had this prayer. We know in the other Gospels, Jesus prays in the Garden of Gethsemane. But in the book of, or in chapter 17, Jesus then turns his conversation to the Father. Okay, so he goes to prayer. What does Jesus pray for, as it's recorded in John chapter 17?
If the cup could pass from but that will be done.
Well, he does in the other Gospels. Okay, he definitely says that, and it's recorded in the other Gospels. Now, John doesn't remember. Each of the Gospels, they overlap, and sometimes they focus on other things. John doesn't talk so much about, let this cup pass from me. He doesn't record that part of the prayer. Praise for himself. Glorify your Son. Why? That the Son may glorify you. So, yeah, please glorify me. Let others see what I'm doing. Why? So that you may be glorified. Jesus says that, look, he wants, verse 3, and this is eternal life, that they know you, the only true God, and Jesus Christ whom you have sent. Verse 4, I glorified you on earth, having accomplished the work you gave me to do. So, time's at an end for his ministry on the earth, and Jesus has accomplished his mission. And now he's asking God, okay, glorify me in your presence. What's to come, basically, is what he's praying for. He talks about, he's given, please be with my disciples. We pick up verses 6 and 7. You gave me, the apostles, disciples, I think apostles here in particular. They know everything that you have given me is from you, verse 7. Verse 8, I've given them the words you gave me. Verse 9, I'm praying for them. I'm not praying for the world, in particular, but I'm praying for these men that you've given me, the apostles, and maybe in a broader sense, the disciples. But I'm leaving the world. I'm coming to you. But please keep them in your name, which you've given me. While I've been with them, I've kept them in your name. I've guarded them and said, we've not lost any except for one, that the scripture might be fulfilled. And remember, Judas has already left at this point. They had the Last Supper, the Passover meal in the upper room. Jesus had said, whoever I give the morsel to, and he gave it to Judas. He said, go do what you're going to do, and do it quickly. Jesus continues on in his prayer. I'm coming to you, and these things I speak, that my joy may be fulfilled in them. He says in verse 17, sanctify them, separate them in the truth, and your word is truth. As you've sent me into the world, and I'm sending them out into the world. But then he said, so he talks about his apostles, or perhaps, and I think perhaps a little bit broader, the disciples who've been with him. But then he says, I'm not praying for these only, but also for those who will believe in me through their word. Is he talking about us? Yeah, I think so. I think everybody who, from that time forward, who believes in Jesus through God's word, through the work of the writers of the Bible, through the apostles, Jesus is praying for us now. And what does he pray? What specifically does he ask for? They all be one. And what's the comparison he uses? Just as you and I, my Father, are one. That's what he's asking. And they may become perfectly one, so that the world may know that you sent me and loved them even as you loved me. And he concludes the prayer in John's account, verse 26, I made known to them your name, and I will continue to make it known, that the love with which you have loved me may be in them and I in them. So that's his final prayer, as recorded by John for his apostles, and by extension us as well, then, for those who believe after them. So we get over to chapter 18. And Jesus spoke in these words, and it says he went out with his disciples across the brook Kidron, where there was a garden which he and his disciples entered. Which garden? Gethsemane. So whether it says it right here or maybe the other Gospels calls it out by name. Verse 2, now Judas, who betrayed him, also knew the place, for Jesus often met there with his disciples. So this was a common area. Okay, Gethsemane. So Jesus and his apostles gathered there. This wasn't the first time they'd ever been there. In other words, and Judas knew his habits, and so, had a pretty good idea that that's where he would be able to find Jesus. So who does Judas have with him?
Angry mob.
You say angry mob, and who else? Soldiers. Yeah, there's several people that make up the mob, but it's yes.
It's scary because they came with lanterns, torches, and weapons.
Right, and the lantern, talking about the lights, the lanterns, I think John's the only gospel that talks about that. But right, it's at night, it's in a garden, it's out, we think garden, it's not, like planting tomatoes. It's kind of in a park type deal, and out in the back, it's outside of the city. And right, they've got a significant number of people, and they've got the lanterns, and they're coming, that help them see, but also it's show of force, and they do have weapons too. Well, and the other thing is, in John talks about a band of soldiers. They had Roman soldiers with them. So there were Roman soldiers, there were the Jewish, kind of the temple soldiers, and that's some of the officers, that's what that is. Some of the Jews who were part of their law enforcement from the chief priest and the Pharisees. And they went out there. So it talked about a cohort in Rome was 600 soldiers. I don't know if they had 600 soldiers, but they had, a number of soldiers from the Romans who they had, Judas, the chief priest, had enlisted to help in this effort. Why do you think the Romans would have sent soldiers?
The peace, this was a very, a lot of people there for the feast.
Right.
And they didn't want chaos and anarchy, happening. And Jesus had gotten very loud at that point and blunt and was stirring things up.
Right, and so, the Jews are there for the Passover. So the city, I don't know if it doubles in size, but there's a lot of people it's an influx of people. Things have been happening. Jesus has been speaking out in Jerusalem, and the Pharisees have been stirred up for sure. The Romans, Pilate, who we're going to talk about in a few minutes, he's there. He normally lives in Caesarea Philippi, but because it's Passover, he's going to be there to keep the peace, basically. So if anything happens, he can make decisions. So again, the Romans, they don't, they want to keep the Jews in line, and they want to keep the peace. So they're enlisted, as well as the real instigators are, of course, the Pharisees, the Sanhedrin, which includes Sadducees, of course, and who, Jesus has been speaking out against them, and their desire for power and not serving God, and so it's already been stated. Caiaphas said, hey, it's expedient we get rid of one guy rather than have the whole people in the country up in arms. But anyway, Jesus knew all this was going to happen, it said in verse 4. And he comes forward and says, who do you seek? They answered him, Jesus of Nazareth. Jesus said, I am he. Judas was right there standing with him. John doesn't talk about the kiss, but, it all happened then. What happened when Jesus said to them, I am He? They fell to the ground. Why do you think that happened? Yeah. There's a couple things. Maybe there's significance to the I am. You know, the reference, of course, God, I am, to Moses, and I am, and Jesus said it earlier in his ministry. So, I am God, basically. And so that could be part of it. And the other thing is, these Roman officials have tried to arrest him, or been told to arrest him before, and they didn't. They'd seen him in action. They were in awe. And so, maybe there's this sort of miraculous part of it, or maybe not. Maybe it's just really the fact that they're in awe and they're in some ways intimidated by Jesus. So, but nevertheless, they do fall back, and yeah, it definitely, they're spooked, without a doubt. And Jesus says, so he asked them again, who do you seek? And they say, Jesus of Nazareth. And Jesus says, I told you that I am He. So if you seek me, let these men go. Okay, thinking about his apostles who were with him. Then what happens here in John's account?
Peter cut off Malchus's ear with a sword.
Right. So Luke talks about, there's some reference to having, the apostles had a couple of swords with them. They weren't all armed, but Peter apparently had a sword, or maybe more of a dagger. I don't know if we think of the long sword.
The high priest's servant. Malchus was the high priest's servant.
Right. Why do you think he cut off his ear? How does that? Now, we're just guessing now. This doesn't mean anything. But why do you think he cut off his ear? How did that happen? Yeah, probably that makes sense. That he was doing this, and Malchus did one of these moves with his head, and he cut off his ear. Well, obviously that's not what Jesus wanted, right? Jesus was willing to go, and obviously he was not establishing a kingdom like many of his followers were still thinking about. And of course, Peter's just trying to protect his friend, I would imagine. But so Jesus said to Peter, put your sword into its sheath. Basically, shall I not drink the cup that the Father's given me? I've got to do this. Now, John doesn't talk about it. We know in the other Gospels, Jesus actually, healed Malchus there with his ear. So, Jesus thinking about his apostles, let them go. So we pick up with verse 12. The band of soldiers and their captain and officers of the Jews, they arrested Jesus and bound him. First, they took him to Annas. So what do we know about Annas in history? He had been the high priest, but for a number of years. But the Romans decided to remove him from that post. So what do you think about the Jews thought about the Romans interfering in their internal affairs by choosing the high priest? Yeah, why aren't you interfering with, so the fact that the Romans had removed Annas, in the Jews' mind, no, they still look to him as being an authority figure. And he was the father-in-law of the current high priest, Caiaphas. But so in John, it records that they took Jesus to Annas first. Couple of the apostles or disciples followed. Who were they? Followed Jesus when he was led to Annas. Peter, Simon Peter, followed Jesus, and so did another disciple. Disciple's not named in keeping with the way. Now, he doesn't say this is the disciple whom Jesus loved, which John refers to himself that way in other places. But in keeping with John not saying, yeah, it's me, another disciple, a lot of people speculated it's John, the Apostle John. But anyway, this unknown, unnamed disciple was known to the high priest. Does that mean, there had been some speculation, well, how could it have been John? He's a fisherman. Of course, he's Jesus' apostle, but, how would he know the high priest? Well, speculation that the whole class system, as far as people interacting with each other, was not necessarily as prevalent as some might guess. And then John, was a successful fisherman, and Zebedee was, his father, and so, it could have been John. But in any event, whoever it is, whichever disciple, they knew the high priest, and I'll just say John. He gets Peter in with him, and they're talking to a servant girl. Servant girl at the door said to Peter, verse 17, "You also are not one of the man's disciples, are you?" Almost kind of in a negative. You're not with him, are you? So, what's Peter's response? No, I'm not. And remember, Jesus had, in his conversation with the apostles, it earlier, may have been the same night, I don't remember now, but, Peter was talking about how he was going to follow Jesus with him, and he said, Jesus said, you're going to, before the cock crows, you're going to deny me 3 times. So, number one, right? And they're outside. So it's probably spring in Jerusalem, but it gets chilly there, just like it gets chilly here, Mount Vernon, Illinois, sometimes in the spring on an evening. And they were standing outside warming themselves while Jesus was inside with Annas. So picking up with verse 19, Annas, the high priest, former high priest, was questioning Jesus. And so what I've read is some of these, we'll say, legal proceedings that are going on, generally the first stage, they would have, kind of like, I guess in the United States, you've got a right to remain silent. You don't have to incriminate yourself. But also there was this aspect of, if you're going to bring charges, kind of like an indictment, you need to have witnesses. But Annas is dispensing with that, and he's talking directly to Jesus. And Jesus says, hey, I've spoke openly to the world. I've taught in the synagogues and temple. I've not done anything in secret. Why don't you ask me? Why don't you ask these people who've heard me? And this sort of goes back to the whole idea that really in this informal proceeding, Annas should have called witnesses anyway. Well, when he said these things, one of the officers, sort of the temple police, standing by, struck Jesus with his hand and, basically, how dare you, talk to the high priest that way? Jesus answered him, if what I said is wrong, here, bear witness about this wrong, but if what I said is right, why don't you strike me? Well, that pretty well ended that interrogation, and so Annas sends him to the real high priest, his son-in-law, Caiaphas. In the meantime, we pick up verse 25, and Peter is, still outside and warming himself, and and somebody, there's conversation strike. You also are not one of the disciples, are you? And he again denies it. But then one of the servants of the high priest, who was a relative of Malchus, whose ear Peter just cut off, a few hours before, he's an eyewitness. He said, well, did I not see you in the garden with him? And so, the first two people asked him, it was kind of well, you're not with him, are you? It was sort of but this is a direct question. Didn't I see you in the garden with Jesus? I saw what you did, basically. And Peter again denies it, and the rooster crows. Now, that's all John says about it. But what do we know from some of the other gospel accounts? What happens after that? Right. He realized what he'd done, and he cried. So then we pick back up. It says they led Jesus from the house of Caiaphas to the governor's headquarters. So this account doesn't talk about what happened in Caiaphas, but he sends him to Pilate. 5, 6 in the morning, something. This has been an all-nighter. Okay, so very early hours in the morning. The Jews, they themselves, and the Jews, the Pharisees, they did not enter the governor's headquarters. They did not want to be defiled. They wanted to be able to eat the Passover. So they're outside of where Pilate's staying. And Pilate goes outside to them, and he's probably an early riser, but anyway, it's early. Whether he was up this early or not, he comes out. What are you accusing this man of? And what's their response? It sounds like the way a lot of people think sometimes. Would we arrest him if he hadn't done anything wrong? So anyway, they're using that logic, and sort of like Kevin says, yeah, trust us. If he wasn't doing anything wrong, we wouldn't have arrested him. And Pilate said, well, go judge him yourselves by your own law. And then the Jews reveal why they came to Pilate. Well, we can't, we want to kill him, and we can't do it by our own law. It's the Passover. And so, they let him know why they're involving Pilate. So Pilate goes inside and calls Jesus. They bring Jesus to him. Pilate has got some sort of report, or he has some basic knowledge, and he says, "Are you the king of the Jews?" And he's, he wants to know what Jesus' response is going to be. Maybe sarcastic, what have you. But are you the king of the Jews? And Jesus says, "Do you say this of your own accord, or did others say it to you about me?" So Jesus always is very good in conversations on turning the tables and trying to get a response from the person he's engaged in a discussion with. And Pilate says, "Well, am I a Jew? Your own nation, the chief priests, have delivered you over to me. So tell me, what have you done?" Again, he's been accused of being king of the Jews, so we're thinking in earthly terms here. But Jesus disabuses Pilate of that notion by saying, "My kingdom is not of this world. If it were, my disciples would have been fighting you right now and trying to prevent being delivered over, by the Jewish leadership. But my kingdom is not from the world." Well, Pilate's still wondering about this. So are you a king? Jesus says, "You say that I'm a king. For this purpose I was born, and for this purpose I have come into the world, to bear witness to the truth. everyone is of the truth, who is of the truth listens to my voice. Pilate said to him, what is truth? And then Pilate walks away. So, why did Pilate ask, what is truth? It's one of the great questions in the Bible.
For centuries it's been asking.
Yes.
You know, is there absolute truth? What is it? How do we know it? People still wrestle with that. Islam, all this stuff.
So that's what Pilate was probably wrestling with. You say truth, what is truth? You know, sincerely, sarcastically, what have you, then he walks out. Goes back to the Jews who were assembled outside and said, look, I find no guilt in him, but Pilate's now looking for a way out because he doesn't find anything wrong with him. He says, well, you've got a custom, I should release one of your prisoners for the Passover. You want me to release to you the King of the Jews? And how'd they respond? Yeah. Barabbas. And who was Barabbas? Yeah. A robber, and even more importantly, probably the rebel rouser part of it, because an insurrectionist. He would have been seeking to overthrow Rome, which, by the way, the Jews would have been okay with that, other than, I guess, the leadership, maybe there's this tension, well, if they get overthrown, but do we still have power, or, we're in their good graces, so you've probably got a little bit of that going on. But in general, no, the Jews, they wanted to get shed of the Romans and have their independence. And here's a guy who was extreme, but he fought for it. And so Pilate, he thought they're going to say, well, surely, that would have, no, I just said the opposite of what they would have thought. But he was very extreme, and he was a robber, he's a criminal. So Pilate thought they were going to say, release Jesus, because here's a guy, Pilate can't find anything wrong with him. No, they say, give us Barabbas. Give us this more hardened criminal, the robber, and the insurrectionist. So Pilate, chapter 19.
His supporters had already probably gathered in the courtyard waiting for that opportunity.
Barabbas's. Yeah, because if that would make sense. This is a custom, and they're anticipating what could happen. Yeah.
23 says Barabbas had been thrown into prison for an insurrection in the city and for murder.
Yeah. Part of the insurrection was murder and for murder. Right. And I think another gospel account said with people who'd committed murder, but that Luke says and for murder. Okay. So this is a hardened criminal. People don't care. Let him go. Their hatred of and desire to have Jesus killed was so strong that they want a hardened criminal released in their midst. So Pilate takes Jesus and flogs him. What's flog? What's flogging? Beat. He. Apparently there are three different kinds, and depending on how extreme, and there is some suggestion that perhaps he was flogged with a certain level, and sometimes they take a whip or rope and put shards of metal on it and that type of thing, and so you just imagine how brutal that was. But there's an idea that perhaps he was flogged initially, and then actually when he was released to go get crucified, he was flogged again, depending on how you read things, and that final flogging was just a totally take somebody down, harm them, exhaust them so much that when they went to be crucified, they were in pain, but they probably didn't last as long. But he was flogged at least once, maybe twice. Yeah. The sour wine. That was on the cross.
I always wondered what was in that cup, and it was maybe something about something they knew he was going to be in pain.
Right. Were you talking about on the cross or before? Okay. Oh, well, I think that meant, now this is just me, but that the cup of, in a figurative sense, that he's going to be crucified. The cup, that's the cup. And that's what I've always thought. But we'll talk about the other cup here a little bit later today or probably next week. But no, the soldiers, they made him a crown. They're mocking him. They made him a crown of thorns, and they put it on his head, and that had to be painful as well when the things are sticking in you. And they put a purple robe on him, purple royalty, and they're just mocking him, and they're striking him. Pilate still, he goes out and says, "Look, I'm bringing to you Jesus," and he's got the robe on and the crown of thorns, and he says, "Behold the man." And, I think Pilate's asking for him, show you a little bit of humanity, sympathy. But no, that's not what the chief priests are saying. They're saying crucify him. I mean, it's full throttle mob now. And Pilate says, "Well, take him yourself. You crucify him. I don't find anything wrong with him, but go ahead." And the Jews, at first they were talking about, well, look, he says he's the king. He's, you don't want to get in trouble, Pilate, because he's, this is political. But now they revert back to the real reason is because he says he's the Son of God. And Pilate heard this and he was even more afraid. There's also, in one of the other Gospels talks about Pilate's wife had a dream or vision, and she sent a message to him like, "Don't do anything to this guy." So all this is going on in Pilate's mind, and Pilate still, he's not done with him yet. Asks Jesus, "Where are you from?" Jesus doesn't answer. He says, "You will not speak to me? Do you not know that I've got authority to crucify you?" And Jesus says, "Well, look, you wouldn't have any authority unless we gave it to you." Basically, God gave it to you, and I gave it to you. And at that point, Pilate delivers him, or from then on, Pilate's still seeking to release him. I mean, he really makes, he doesn't want to kill him. But it's when the Jews say, "Well, look," that they get to him politically. They said, "If you release him, you're no friend of Caesar." So Pilate knew, they got him on the political angle, and so he brings Jesus out again, and again says, "Behold your king." He's still trying to get out of killing Jesus. He knows it's not right, but they, again, they're crying out, "Crucify him. Shall I crucify your king?" And now they play the political angle. We have no king but Caesar. Of course, they didn't like Caesar, so this is all, they're all playing Pilate. And but anyway, that's when they took Jesus away to be crucified. And we will we'll talk about that next week, and Jesus' resurrection, and his final words to his disciples.